If you're looking for a banger PvP build for Albion Online, you've come to the right video. Because today I'm going to show you 3 different builds that I think are very strong when playing solo in the open world. I've tried out many different weapons and builds to see which ones work best for me, and this is my personal top 3 I've had the most fun and success with. Starting with the one I had the easiest time on by far, we're looking at the one-shot Bloodletter. Now, one-shotting in Albion Online has a slightly different meaning compared to other games, since in other games you're typically talking about one-shotting when you delete someone with just one hit. But in Albion Online, we tend to say one-shotting when you delete someone in just one rotation, and that's exactly what this build does. This build is very easy to play and straightforward in its approach. You basically use all your offensive abilities to get someone low enough and then execute them with your E ability. And since this build is fully centered around damage, getting someone below 40% health to execute them is easily done. Aside from having a lot of damage on this Bloodletter build, you also have a lot of mobility on it, which makes this build a top tier pick for the open world. Not only is mobility great to have to chase people down, but from time to time you may also find yourself in dangerous or unfair situations where you will need mobility to distance yourself from it. So your offensive toolkit can also be used defensively when you have to prioritize surviving. On the Bloodletter, you want to take Deadly Swipe on your Q for mobility and damage, Chain Slash on your W for the mobility, the damage, and the utility it makes for, which are invisibility and immunity, and for the passive, you want to take Deep Cuts for an extra bleed that will add even more damage to this build. Your E ability on this weapon is Lunging Stabs, which you want to use when a target is below 40% health, as it adds a lot of bonus damage to this ability, which will often be enough to execute someone successfully. If you hit a target below 40% health with this ability, you will also get a huge cooldown buff, which adds a lot of utility to this build. Even if you don't manage to execute someone that's below 40% health with Lunging Stabs, the cooldown reset on it should be enough to secure your kill with your other abilities that should be backed up by now. To use the Lunging Stabs as an execution tool successfully, you first have to get your target below 40% health. And that's what the rest of your build is for. So let's take a look at what those pieces are and what they are good for. The damage in your build starts with the poison on your Mage Cowl, which applies the dot on your next auto attack. You also have the Tedford Cape, which releases a Chain Lightning that also does damage on your auto attack every 15 seconds. On top of that, you also have the Deep Cuts passive on your weapon that will apply a bleed every few auto attacks. Altogether, all these abilities make for a huge amount of damage on your auto attacks, with the most damage being done in the first one, meaning you have to auto attack as much as possible with this build. To increase all these damage effects even more, you wield the Musak for your offhand and use the beef stew as your food. Then you also have the Poison Potion, which adds another dot to this build that also reduces the defenses of your target, which simply leaves them even more vulnerable to your huge burst of damage. Finally, you have the Cleric Robe, which makes you immune to damage for 3 seconds, but also increases your own damage when activated. So if you use your abilities whilst the Cleric Robe is active, you will be doing even more damage. As you can see, this build simply has a lot of damage to it, which is enough to delete about any player in the open world within a matter of seconds. Sometimes even in the blink of an eye if you pull off your combo perfectly. The final item in this build is the Soldier Boots, which can be used to chase someone down or escape from a given situation. Now, although this build has enormous pros as you've heard so far, it absolutely comes with its own cons, just like any other build in the game. First of all, this build is very squishy. Your only defense is pretty much the Cleric Robe, which gives you a few seconds of immunity to damage. Other than that, you have no defenses at all. Since you're wearing the Cleric Robe, you're also in Cloth Armor, meaning your armor provides low defenses on top of that. So you're basically a glass cannon. You can delete someone very quickly and easily, but if you aren't careful, they can delete you very quickly and easily as well. Other than that, you do have rather high cooldowns on most of your important abilities, so you have to be careful not to misuse them, as doing so can screw up your entire combo and even get you killed. Nonetheless, I did find this build to be the easiest one to play. It has a very low skill ceiling, so if you decide to pick it up, you can get going once you unlock Chain Slash. This build is also relatively cheap as it doesn't use any expensive artifact items whatsoever, making this build a very solid pick for solo PvP in the open world. Next up, we have a build that features the one-handed spear, which is a weapon I've been talking about in multiple videos ever since the Lands Awakened update. The one-handed spear is simply great for solo PvP in the open world, as it is a very versatile weapon with a lot of utility, mobility, and even range. The great thing about this weapon is that you can play it with many different builds and change up your playstyle very easily by swapping the individual pieces. This way you can tune the build towards a more defensive, utility or damage oriented build, or in other words, to your personal wishes, by just swapping one or two items instead of having to change to another weapon altogether. This keeps the weapon fun to play over longer periods of time and makes it a very worthy one of leveling to higher levels. I would say this weapon's playstyle is the complete opposite of the Bloodletters we just went over, since the Bloodletter is all about bursting someone down very quickly and the spear has a more sustained approach to its battles. You don't really have abilities with a lot of damage on this weapon, so if you want to make this weapon about damage, you have to do so in the rest of your build. And although that is a viable way of going about it, I like to go with a more balanced approach between damage, defenses and utility, which works great for me in my PvP battles within the open world. Which is why I like to use the following build with the one-handed spear whenever roaming solo. With this build, you want to take Lunging Strike on your Q, which you use to poke your enemies and build up charges. These charges increase your auto attack damage, making for big numbers on them. And since we use the Deathgivers Cape with this build as well, your auto attacks play a huge role in the amount of damage you do with this build. Which is why the attack speed passive on this weapon is a nice choice that will help in that area. The Torch offhand makes for even more attack speed and cooldown reduction, which are two great perks for this weapon and build. Now the W you take on this weapon fully depends on the matchup, but whenever playing in the open world, I take Impaler as my default. It has range to it, does a good chunk of damage, and slows anyone hit by it, which are three different features in just one ability that make for a lot of value in the open world. Impaler can be used to slow your enemies down as you are chasing them, or to slow them down as they are chasing you. Your E ability is mostly for utility, and it's what makes the one-handed spear such a great pick for the open world. The damage on it is on the lower end and mediocre at best when you use it with the max amount of charges, but it does have a pretty low cooldown on it, so using it for utility purposes, which is either mobility or crowd control, is the better play most of the time when you are playing this build. As long as you make sure you have 3 charges up when using your E offensively, you will get the maximum value out of this ability. But of course, if you have to escape, you want to use your E to increase the gap, and when you want to catch up with someone, you want to use it to close the gap. And the same goes for your soldier boots, which you can use to escape or chase someone down. Other than that, we use the assassin jacket for invisibility, which can be used to shake off enemies as you are escaping, or buy some time during a battle where you wait for your cooldowns or wait for your enemy's buffs to run out. Finally, the hunter hood reflects damage back at the attacker, punishing them for their actions. So if you want to play a build that is in control of the fight, where you decide how the battle goes, this one-handed spear build might be the one for you. So what about the cons of this build? I would say the biggest one for this build is that the fights on it tend to be rather lengthy. And that's the dangerous thing in the open world, where many players are roaming around looking to kill one another. You'll be spending more time killing other players with this build compared to something like the Bloodletter, meaning you'll be spending more time on the ground. So the chance of a third party dismounting on you or your enemy getting reinforcements does increase. However, since you do have a good amount of mobility, you do have a chance to get out safely as long as your big abilities aren't on cooldown. For the final build, we have one that I think is one of the most fun PvP builds one can play. And this one is actually mechanically challenging. So unlike the 2 builds I've mentioned so far, it is rather difficult to play and pull off successfully. However, after getting the rotation down and understanding how the abilities work, you will be a beast in PvP. And don't be misled by me starting off with saying it's a lot of fun, because it really is as dangerous as it is fun. So it's very fun to play and very dangerous. The build in question features the Deathgivers, which makes for a very smooth playstyle. As long as the conditions are met, you can reset your E on this weapon and use it back to back. Aside from dealing a good chunk of damage with your E, you also become invisible for a short duration. So there is a lot of utility to this weapon that will confuse most of your enemies. Now, to reset the cooldown on your E after using it, you need to meet one of the conditions, which is either 3 Sunder Armor charges on your enemy or 3 Assassin Spirit charges on yourself. To meet this condition as best as possible, you want to take Assassin Spirit on your Q, which will build up these charges over time. So you can simply pre-stack these charges as you are going into battle. On your W, you take Chain Slash for the damage and utility, and on the passive, you take Deep Cuts for additional damage. Damage is a very important aspect of the Deathgivers because you want to make sure your enemy dies within a timely manner. Therefore, you also take Beef Stew, the Tattered Cape, and Poison Potions to add even more damage to this build. The Stalker Hood also makes for more damage, but ideally you want to use it when your target is below 50% health so that you also reduce their resistances. The Assassin Jacket acts as a huge utility where you become invisible for a rather long period, which is great to build up your Q charges or buy some time for your other cooldowns to get back up. You also get a big boost to damage on your first hit after losing the buff, which can help a lot with securing your kill if you combine it with one of your other abilities. Then you also have the Helion Shoes, which will turn you invisible and teleport you to your target, whilst granting you a big damage buff. So not only do you have a lot of damage features in this build, but you also have multiple invisibility features. Not only will you delete your enemies very quickly with the Deathgivers, you will also leave them clueless to what exactly happened. The cool thing about this build is that since you have a lot of damage, you can even tag yourself onto mounts and teleport to them and dismount other players very quickly. And since your E will reset, you will still have your E after dismounting someone. So this build can be great to kill players you would otherwise have a difficult time catching in the first place. Nonetheless, this build does have its cons as well, with the major one being lack of mobility. Mobility is a very important thing to have when playing in the open world, and in this build you sacrifice that a little and have it in very different ways. So instead of some run ability, you have a teleport instead, which if you are creative can be used on mobs etc. to get yourself out of dangerous situations. Managing your cooldowns properly is the most crucial on this build out of the 3 builds mentioned in this video. So keep these things in mind as you go about playing the Deathgivers in the open world. So now you have 3 different PvP builds that you can try out. Hopefully one of these builds will click and you will have a great time playing them. Although I did show PvP footage throughout this video, you may want to watch some more. If you want to watch more of the Bloodletter, I recommend you check out Kokosmi. If you want to see the one-handed spear in action, check out Nomad Poncho. And if you want to see some sick Deathgiver plays, I recommend you check out Ninja Academy. Make sure to like this video if you found it helpful and feel free to subscribe for more Albion content. As always, have fun in your journey and I'll see you next time.